Okay, so in this second lecture for Text and Context, week 9 on the island, we're going to be looking at the theatrical contexts. Now, in the first lecture, we talked about the political context of South Africa during the 20th century generally, but more specifically in the 1970s when the play The Island was produced. And we talked in particular about the apartheid rules that were in place, which involved racial segregation. Now, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the theatrical context. So theatre in South Africa in the 1970s, how it was responding to those apartheid laws, especially amongst black actors at the time. We're also going to be talking about political theatre as a concept and approaches to political theatre, and what we might call improv or improvisational theatre, which is a kind of theatrical method that was deployed in the putting together, effectively in the kind of the construction or writing of the island. I also hope to share a couple of clips from interviews with Athol Fugard and John Carney a bit later on, after I think in the sort of early 2000s, but talking about their experiences of putting together the play and putting it together the theatre company that produced the play. Along or in the midst of that, I'm also going to talk about a particularly relevant theoretical context, which is the writings of Frantz Fanon, who was an important political theorist and activist of colonialism and post-colonialism in the mid-20th century period. And we can see kind of resonances with his theories and what they were trying to do with the island. Okay, so as we saw in the last lecture, the very strict apartheid laws restricted the things that the black populations could actually do in a professional sense in South Africa during this period. So as with all South African public life, the theatres and most theatre companies were segregated along racial lines. Under the apartheid laws, black people were not allowed to be professional actors, or certainly weren't allowed to, to run their own theatre companies. There was only certain kind of occupations and professions that were open to the black populations. Now, the island came out of a collaboration involving a group called the Serpent Players, who I'll say more about in a moment, and actually a white South African playwright called Athol Fugard. So we'll have a think about how this came together. Now, the Serpent Players, as I said earlier, they couldn't be kind of professional actors, but what they could do, or what they did do, was form a kind of an amateur black theatre company. And this particular company, a few of these were produced across South Africa, but in Port Elizabeth, the Serpent Players came together they were actually formed in 1965. Their first performance apparently was in an abandoned open air space at the old Johannesburg Zoo. What they had to do was to find kind of places where they could put on their plays while still adhering to the kind of the apartheid laws. Now, the aim of the Serpent Players was to give what they called a professional level platform for black actors, even though they were officially kind of amateur. And the company, soon after it was formed, became what we might call mixed race. So there was, black and white actors involved, which was itself a kind of political statement in the context of South Africa during the period, a kind of a comment of resistance to the prevailing ideologies at the time. And what they did, they staged successful productions in the townships just after the period when they were formed. A bit later on, into the sort of mid to later 60s, they approached Athol Fugard. And Athol Fugard, as I say, was a a white South African, a radical playwright, a theatre director, who had political sympathies with the resistance movements against apartheid. I think can the certain players want to expand? I guess given the relative success they were having under the kind of apartheid system, they wanted to try and reach out. This is a picture more or less during the time, or I think probably early 70s, this of the group, or of the three of them. That's John Carney there on the left, Athol Fugard in the centre, and Winston Nshona on the right. And they kind of worked together and collaborated in the production of plays, in the production and writing of plays. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying earlier, Carney and Nshona were members of the Serpent Players, and they invited Fugard to join them, or made contact with him. And when they kind of initially started working together, as they were doing at the period, they were kind of as most, I suppose, as many theatre companies would be doing at that time in the 60s. They were doing kind of classical European repertoire, so classical Roman and Greek plays, Shakespeare, Chekhov, Brecht, Beckett, Anwil, etc. The kind of popular, either the popular contemporary writers of the period, European writers on the whole, or from the classical tradition. But what they were felt is that they were not connecting with the black audiences. What they wanted to try and do is to make plays that seemed more relevant to the conditions and the life of those people, of the audiences that were coming to see these plays. So what they tried to do was to kind of develop what they might call, or connect with what we might call political theatre. They started to fashion their own dramatic pieces that spoke directly to the concerns of their audiences. Interestingly, though, they didn't kind of necessarily abandon the classical tradition as a point of reference or contrast, but adapted it to their own needs. So before we have watch a clip of Fugard and Carney talking about this process, I thought we'd talk a little bit about political theatre as a kind of as a type of theatre. Now, political theatre in the 60s and 70s was influenced by the East German dramatist at that moment, at that time, Bertolt Brecht, who had developed a kind of method of political theatre, which we can understand as a theatre produced to promote political activity and resistance. Brecht was not interested in providing sort of entertainment pieces for the bourgeois classes, but wanted to use theatre as a tool to effect social, cultural, and political change. Now, Brechtian techniques often include placing actors amidst the audience, or you'd be watching a play and then suddenly someone sitting next to you might stand up and start to join in the performance, and you sort of very quickly realise they're one of the actors. But they also wanted to, often would change costume on stage. If what they were trying to do was what Brecht called the alienation effect, to kind of defamiliarize the idea that there was a barrier between the world of the play and the world, the real world, the world of the audience kind of lived in. What we might call these days breaking the fourth wall. But for Brechtian theatre, it was a particular kind of political move. What Brechtian theatre often did would have political narratives, political themes played out on the stage, but were then connecting to what was going on in the lives of the audiences. In interview, and it's probably this is the time we can listen to Carney and Fugard talking about this, but they both of them described the way in which they developed their political theatre after initially sort of performing that classic European repertoire. So I'm just going to show a clip now. The quality is not great. It's a very old clip, but I think it gives us a sense of what was going on at that particular period.
The group that I had assembled, no, I hadn't assembled, they'd found me actually, had access to nothing. They had, they couldn't even be members of the Port Elizabeth Public Library. Mm. So what existed in world drama was a totally closed book to them. Mm. And as we started working, our very first effort was an adaptation of The Mandrake, and then we followed it up with Wojciech Buchner. I introduced the group to that.
We sat down after doing Coriolanus, Antigone, Wojciech, Brecht, Caucasian Chalk Circle, and all these English plays, because we were learning to act like the English. We watched videos of Lord Olivier, we watched movies, and the concept of theatre was a white monopoly, so we had to have these wonderful gestures and these credible accents to try and sound like black Englishmen, but we couldn't reach our audiences. They didn't understand what we were talking about. We moved into contemporary theatre, Sartre, Genet, Beckett, Strindberg, and all that, and still the audiences couldn't understand our work because we were like, those guys who do white people's theatre. That's what they were referring to us. So we decided to hold a meeting with the certain players. We took a political decision that from now on, our work is going to address the political life of the people of South Africa.
We decided that we were going to use theatre, the primitive little stages of Port Elizabeth and New Brighton, to give us a voice to talk about and examine and speak about things that we weren't able to talk and speak about in other circumstances.
So in that clip, we can see John Carney and Athol Fugard talking about the way in which they developed their theatre from moving from the European repertoire into plays that were speaking directly to the conditions and the experiences of the audiences who were coming to see the plays. As Carney has said in an interview on the plays he produced with Fugard that shown the quote, "The first performances of the plays were like political meetings." So it's at this stage I wanted to just pause for a second and move out to a kind of a theoretical context. And I want to talk a little bit about the writer Frantz Fanon, who was a very influential political activist in writing in the mid part of the 20th century, whose in addition to kind of political theory around post-colonialism generally and the colonial context, has very interesting things to say about the role of writers in relation to this colonialist process, or the colonial into the post-colonial context. Now, Fanon, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, which was produced in 1961, so this more or less of the same period that we're talking about with the island, he writes about what he calls three phases in post-colonial literature. Now, Fanon himself was a kind of Caribbean-born French writer, born in Martinique, which was a colony of France. Very interesting, not only a philosopher, revolutionary, but also a kind of psychiatrist. As I say, writing roughly at the same time, perhaps a little bit earlier, but very influential on the independence movements in the post-World War II period and in the colonial context. Now, in terms of post-colonial literature, he identifies what he calls three phases, three kind of moments in which the writer, a writer from an indigenous or a colonized people, might respond to the literary context in which they're placed. So the first of these he calls assimilation. Now, assimilation, he talks about the phase, and this is the phase when colonization is in its highest power, I guess, or its highest influence. And he talks about, I mean, he talks about he uses the word native, which clearly problematic now, but he's talking about the kind of indigenous population when he talks about the native intellectual. This is what he writes about this first phase. He says, in the first phase, the native intellectual gives proof that he has assimilated the culture of the occupying power. His writings correspond point to point with those of his opposite numbers in the mother country. So what he means here, that in this first phase, the colonized writer, the native intellectual, as Fanny calls him, tries to write in the forms and models that are handed down to him or her by the dominant colonial literature. So it takes on the values and the forms that are imposed by the colonizing power. This, he says, then moves on to a second phase, where he talks about the native again. The native intellectual is, quote, in the second phase we find the native is disturbed. He decides to remember what he is. Since the native is not part of his people, he is content to recall their life only. So this, I guess we might call this a kind of identity crisis, in the fact that there's a sort of jarring between what the writer, the forms and the styles that the writer is trying to work in, which have been inherited from the colonial power, and what he kind of sees in terms of what's going on with the population, the colonized population. I suppose we should also say that Fanon's language is very masculine as well in this context. He's talking about the colonial writer as a he, but I think in the theory we can think about that he or she. Now this crisis phase, identity crisis phase, eventually moves on to what he calls a revolutionary literature. This is what he writes about that. He says, finally, in the third phase, which is called the fighting phase, the native turns himself into an awakener of the people. Hence comes a fighting literature, a revolutionary literature, and a national literature to compose the sentence which expresses the heart of the people. So I think this is a very interesting theory in relation to what we've identified in the island. The island could be seen as this kind of example of the third type of post-colonial literature. This fighting phase, or revolutionary phase, a revolutionary literature. And in fact, I guess what the serpent players and with Fugard moved through the various stages of Fanon's process. So started by trying to adapt those European plays, but then eventually moved to a kind of type of theatre that was speaking directly to the concerns of the audiences. Okay, so we can think about then how they may produce this kind of political theatre. And in order to do so, Fugard in particular drew on another influence that was around at the time, the experimental Polish playwright Jerzy Grotowski. Now this was felt, Grotowski's method was felt to be a kind of more democratic method to the production of plays, to the writing of plays, and therefore there was a nice parallel with the political concerns, really, that kind of advocacy of democracy and equality across the races, but also in this sense in the relationship between, let's say, the director and the writers and the actors. Now, for Grotowski's method, the performance is located in the actors, not the script. I guess we might think of traditional theatre in the sense that you have the play script and the actors kind of interpret the words, as it were. They may interpret in slightly different ways, but nevertheless, the play script is regarded as the kind of the origin of the play. For Grotowski, this was very different. The performance was actually located in the actors, not the script. His book, Towards a Poor Theatre, explains this. So in the context of the island, and this was happening in lots of other places as well, but this is something that Fugard was influenced by. And so in the plays that were being developed with the Serpent players, they were trying to develop kind of organically through theatre workshops, through improvisational theatre, what came to be known as improv. And this is how the island was developed, a collaboration between Fugard as director and Carney and the showrunner as actors. So they would kind of act out scenes, and what they did actually was develop plot lines based on the actors' experiences and stories they had heard about Robben Island. Things that they'd heard about going on there. They thought they'd try and develop a play in relation to that. Okay, so I'm going to pause again at this moment, and in the third lecture we're going to talk specifically about what they produce. So we're going to talk about the alley, about the structure of the play and some of the main themes, and perhaps have a look at some passages from the play.